Yes.
So before we move on to the 1980s, I wondered if I might just very briefly return to the table we were just looking at. A representative for one of the core participant groups has helpfully pointed out a couple of features of that table that I think I should bring to your attention. Thanks, Sully. So we are back at the same table. At the bottom of this page, the first point to note is that cryoprecipitate is included in the list of products. You may have already picked up on this 10% present use. More importantly, over the page, when we look again at those entries for factor 8 and factor 9, I wanted to highlight the asterisk that appears next to the minus symbol. So for factor 8, no asterisk appears. For factor 9, an asterisk appears next to the 1 year's reserve. And if we look below in parentheses, it says that the asterisk means capable of achievement with present PFC stocks. Now, it's not entirely clear to me what those two symbols mean together. On the one hand, there's 1 year's reserve isn't achieved. On the other hand, a year's reserve can be achieved with present stocks. There's a little more explanation in the passage which follows, but I just thought I'd highlight that for anyone who's watching, and perhaps for you to note that this is another feature of that table.
Yes, as a matter of literal reading, it's inconsistent, but that's probably not what it means.
It must be, that's right, sir. Yeah, I agree. It must mean something. It's not altogether clear what it does mean. Thank you. So we move into the 1980s. It's important to note that when we get to the 1980s, and I'm not going to take you, sir, to any documents about this, that there has been, in the late 1970s to about 1980, 1981, significant changes and developments in manufacturing processes at the PFC. We pointed to, in the written notes, some documents which set some of those out. They cover things like continuous thawing. Dr. Foster, in his statement, suggests that between 1976 and 1981, factor 8 yields increased by about 50%. Now, I'm not going to go into any more detail about that issue, but it's an important part of the picture as we move into the late 70s and early 80s, and we're trying to understand changes to supply of concentrates.
Well, it increased about 50%.
That's the suggestion, I believe, in Dr. Foster's statement, yes, sir, between 76 and 81. 50% by 81. I am going to take you to a couple of documents from 1980 which go to this issue of PFC's distribution arrangements. They seem to relate to the introduction of a pro rata arrangement sometime in the early 1980s, but they also link back to this stockpile question. The first one is PRSE 304005. Now, this is a letter from Mr. Watt to Dr. Bolton in the Edinburgh and South East Transfusion Centre. We don't need to go to all of it. I think the context of this letter is that Professor Ludlum is trying to obtain more factor 8 for his patients in Edinburgh, I believe, in order to place more patients on the home treatment programme. If I can just highlight the second paragraph here, where Mr. Watt summarises what the distribution arrangements are at that time for PFC product, and he says the present situation regarding the distribution of factor 8 to regional centres from the PFC is that as each pool comes to be ready for issue, we place 10% in the national stockpile to be available for emergency purposes, and the remainder is distributed to regional centres in a proportion which has been agreed by the directors. That's roughly according to the distribution of population in the various regions, the slight bias in favour of Inverness, where the geography of the region makes a more widespread utilisation of home therapy a rather necessary fact of life. So that's the position as of February 1980. We can pick things up later in the year, December 1980, with PRSE 304005. This is another letter from Mr. Watt, this time to Professor Cash.
Probably is.
I hope it is.
This is not looking at the right one.
No, I'll give you... Oh, I might have given you the wrong reference, Sally, I'm sorry.
You gave me the same reference as you had
I've
done
given
for
the same
voting
reference I
letter.
had before. Sorry, I've got the right one here. PRSC 302207. Thank you. So this is December 1980. Later on in the same year, again, Mr. Watt, a letter to Professor Cash, and I'm going to look at the introductory passages of the letter. Mr. Watt says, after our discussion, I've made the following arrangements for the distribution of factor VIII concentrates to be effective from 1st of January 1981. Each month, when we prepare the total issue from production, we shall allocate as follows. The first 15% of the total product will be placed in the National Reserve. That contrasts with the 10% figure that we just looked at. There is a special arrangement for Inverness, as there was in the previous letter, and then there is a summary of the proportions that will be provided to the remaining regions in Scotland. And at the bottom of this page, Mr. Watt outlines some ways in which the proportions might be adjusted month to month, refers to a league table which exists at PFC. So that's position at the end of 1980. As we get into 1981, one of the issues that becomes significant at PFC is a medicines inspectorate report. I'm not going to go to the detail of that report, so some of it is set out in the written note. I believe it's also covered by Dr. Foster in his statement, but it's an important part of the chronology and trying to understand what's happening around this time. I believe the visits start from the inspectors in 1979. They produce some initial comments. There's an updated report that they produce in October 1981. And that timing and what's set out in that October 1981 report is relevant both for what's going to happen at PFC in the years that follow. It's also relevant to those discussions that we were looking at yesterday between Scotland and England. This figure of £6 to £7 million appears, which is linked to changes that are going to be necessary to be made at PFC.
Well, half of them, I think we decided, or roughly.
That's a suggestion in one of the letters. I believe, I don't have the reference immediately to hand, that number is divided up differently in different documents.
I think you mentioned that yesterday.
Yes.
But it's somewhere between 0 and 6 or 7, but it's probably round about half.
It might be round about half. It's certainly a proportion of that figure. I'm going to turn now to a document from December 1981. It's PRSE 303364. And it's one which relates both to where PSE had got to in terms of its supply, but also this question of stockpile. And I'm also going to pick up in this document a reference to that contrast between the MBTS and the SNBTS that I couldn't find earlier. It appears a bit later in time. This is when it appears. So this is an 8th of December 1981 meeting of SNBTS directors. If we could go through, please, to page 3. And the passage in section 4, national stocks of blood products. So in the first paragraph there's a reference to a table of PFC products which have been issued. And then in the second paragraph, there's a reference to what self-sufficiency was understood to mean by SNBTS directors at the time. So it was agreed that the concept of self-sufficiency implied uninterrupted supply, and that generally the national stock should consist of 12 months' usage of products labelled and ready for issue. It was also mentioned that there would be an evaluation of a pro rata distribution of product, which I think ties in with that document from late 1980 that we just looked at. And if we go to page 5, please. Thank you. And the second paragraph that appears on that page, you can see the contrast between the Scottish figures and those in England and Wales. But there had also been discussion on the current target of 2.75 million units of factor rate per million population per annum, in view of the fact that the current NBTS target was 2 million units per million population per annum. So it's been decided, and it was decided then to retain the target of 275. So a significantly higher target for the production of factor rate in Scotland than in England and Wales at that time. Now, as we're moving through 1981, so we can see from the documents and set out in a written note that plasma supply is increasing very significantly to PFC. A problem that begins to emerge relates to the amount of plasma that's been sent and whether or not PFC could fractionate it all quickly enough. There's a memo which is in the note, 20th of August 1981, where reference is made to an estimated 25% growth in supply of fresh frozen plasma in 6 months. And we can see some of those issues reflected in a document we'll go to now, another letter from Mr. Watt, PRSC 302316. And this is a letter which gives us some insight into that particular difficulty that I was just describing, but also more generally into PFC's production capacity around this time. So it's dated February 1982. It's from Mr. Watt to Mr. Cash. If we go down to the first couple of paragraphs, Mr. Watt said that by the time of the March issue of factor rate under the pro rata scheme, the PFC will be substantially in debt to the regions. He then referred to a slowly gathering difficulty because of freeze-dryer limitation at PFC. At present, we're getting 600 kilos of fresh plasma weekly and can process up to 720 kilos in a full capacity week. If a lot is missed, for whatever reason, the net effect is to increase plasma stock, which can't be cleared. He also makes reference to the shift working trial that we looked at yesterday and its effect on stocks of plasma. If we go down, we've got it up here, but if we look towards the bottom of the screen, Mr. Watt says, in summary, with a new shelf in a dryer, which he outlines elsewhere in the letter, and a reduction of cycle time by correction of a fault, we expect to increase plasma process capacity for fresh frozen plasma to about 2,000 kilos per full 2-week period. In other words, about 1,000 kilos a week. Suggests that this will help to make inroads into the stockpile and also keep up with inputs.
So the new shelf in the dryer, is that the something which occurred because just the dryer, it has to be utilised, that there is a little bit of space, but the bottles are too tall, and so the size of the bottles is reduced, or they get smaller bottles. Is this the where they found space for the new shelf in the dryer? Do you remember?
It's a good question, sir. I'm not sure. I'm not sure is the answer. I don't know if it relates to the size of the bottles. It may well.
I think it may be Dr. Foster who talks about that, but
yeah.
I can't remember where I recently read that. But I was just wondering if this was the extra shelf.
You could well be right. So I'm sorry, I can't assist by confirming that particular point. It could well be that we could check it by checking Dr. Foster's statement or confirming with him when he's giving evidence. That sounds right. That sounds like what a new shelf in a dryer would help to achieve.
But it's a lesson in it for people packing their fridges, really.
Yes, yeah, exactly. Yeah. I'm going to pick things up later in 1982, 30th of September 1982, and I'm going to go to a letter sent from Mr. Watt to the Glasgow and West of Scotland RTC, because it picks up on that issue that we were discussing earlier about the national stockpile and the effect that that might have on product being sent to particular RTCs. It's PRSE 40408. So a letter from Mr. Watt to the Glasgow and West of Scotland RTC. In the first paragraph, Mr. Watt referred to the perilous state of factor rate supply. He then actually still in that first paragraph, I'm sorry, in the first sentence, he refers to an arrangement between the Glasgow RTC and the PFC, and he thanks Dr. Hopkins for the generous decision to return 2,000 vials of factor rate concentrate to the national stock. Now, what that appears to be referring to is a request from Mr. Watt at the PFC to an RTC to get some factor rate concentrate back in order to build up the national stock rather than it remaining at the RTC and then being sent to patients. Now, the implications of this sort of arrangement aren't immediately clear from this letter or from some of the other documents we have. From a patient's perspective, it's not entirely clear what the effect might be, because it's not clear from these documents whether returning or keeping back more PFC concentrate in the national stock will mean for a patient that they're treated with cryoprecipitate or treated with commercial concentrates. So we can't get that part, that effect of the arrangement from these documents, but it does provide some further insight into how this policy of having a significant national stock, national reserve at PFC could play out during these years in the early 1980s. So now at this point in the written note, so we've got a few documents summarised and a few paragraphs relating to freeze-dried cryoprecipitate. I'm not intending to take you through any of those, and it's an important issue at this time. The broad brush headline picture is that there were proposals to investigate the production of freeze-dried cryoprecipitate, particularly in the west of Scotland. There was a trial that was agreed. This all takes place between about 1980 and 1983. The PFC's input, so far as we can see, are a number of letters from Mr. Watt, in which Mr. Watt sets out his pretty firmly expressed opposition to any sort of move to producing freeze-dried cryoprecipitate. He has some opinions expressed both on freeze-dried cryoprecipitate as a product, and also suggests that if there's going to be any move towards making it, it could not be produced at PFC, or at least he would strongly oppose it being produced at the PFC. Now that gets us to 1983 to 1984. I will pick matters up with a meeting of SNBTS directors, and I think haemophilia directors in January 1983. That's PRSE 301736. Now this, yes, we can see it's a meeting of SNBTS and haemophilia directors. It's got a few passages that I'll take you to, so which provide both a summary of what's been happening in recent years and also set out the position as it was at that time. If we could go over the page, please. The second half of that page, subparagraph A, trends in supply and demand. I won't read all this out, but what you'll see and what will be apparent from this summary of the 5-year period from 1978 to 1982 is that there have been very significant increases in PFC's production of factor VIII concentrate. Alongside that, a decrease in the amount of cryoprecipitate being issued from RTCs. If we go over the next page, please, page 3. And there's a discussion starting at paragraph 2 about continued purchases of commercial products in Scotland at this time, 1983. Concern was again expressed about the amount of commercially produced factor VIII which was still being purchased. Members went on to discuss the regional breakdown of the usage of cryoprecipitate, PFC concentrate, and commercially produced factor VIII. It was noted that while purchases of commercial factor VIII had declined in Glasgow, purchases in Edinburgh had increased. Dr Ludlum explained that the reasons for the use of commercial material in Edinburgh were partially clinical and partially a policy of conserving a cushion of NHS factor VIII against an anticipated shortage when production at the PFC would be suspended to carry out alterations required by the Medicines Inspectorate. So that's a link back to that report produced by the Inspectorate suggestion that there's going to be a need to undertake some works and a slowdown in production. In the second paragraph, I'll just highlight the second part of that. This is in response to fears of future shortage of factor VIII supply. It said that fears of a shortage were remote, and he, Mr. Watt, was confident that in cooperation between regions, difficulties could be overcome. Dr. Cash emphasised that the pro rata scheme was not intended to be applied inflexibly. Products could be transferred between regions in the event of a local shortage. And in the next paragraph, I'm just going to note a sentence in the middle of that. Dr. Ludlum also expressed some misgivings that Edinburgh perhaps did not receive as much PFC factor VIII concentrate as it should pro rata. The reason for highlighting that is that I'm going to briefly describe an arrangement that came to be agreed between Dr. Ludlum in Edinburgh and Dr. Main in Northern Ireland around this time, for there to be an exchange of commercial and PFC concentrate between the two centres. If we go to page 5, this is really just briefly to note the position on factor 9, subparagraph F. All it said is the supply position of defects over the last 5 years had remained strong, demand reasonably stable, so no issues, it seems, with the supply of factor 9. And just finally, on page 7, this is not so much on the supply issue, sir, but this is more to note that this issue was discussed at this meeting. In the middle of the page, there's a reference to AIDS. So this is 21st of January 1983. Dr. Cash drew members' attention to recent articles in the United States and also in the Observer and the Lancet about this problem. An MMWI extract, CDC Atlanta, had been circulated with his paper. Dr. Ludlum informed members that in the UK, a letter and questionnaire had been sent out to haemophilia directors. Now, the arrangement between Edinburgh and Northern Ireland is one that I'll summarise briefly. It's set out with as much detail as we've been able to provide in the written note, although there's not much in the way of documentation about it. The arrangement appears to have been that around the start of 1983, Dr. Ludlum agreed with Dr. Main that Scotland would send commercial product to Northern Ireland, and in exchange, Dr. Main would return some of the PFC product that had been sent to Northern Ireland to Edinburgh in Scotland. We have got a letter that I'll briefly take you to about that arrangement from the end of December 1983. It's LOTH, 6 zeros, 5_071. Thank you. So this is a letter from Dr. Brian McLellan to Dr. Ludlum, end of December 1983, by which point, as we'll see, the arrangement has been in existence for some time. This is essentially Dr McLellan asking Dr Ludlum whether this arrangement was intended to continue. He says, it's just been pointed out to him that we're continuing to receive substantial deliveries of PFC Factor 8 from Belfast. I was indeed aware that you had on one occasion made an exchange with Dr Mayne, that should be M-I-Y-N-E, for some commercial Factor 8, which you had previously purchased, but I did not know that the process was continuing. The next paragraph, so I don't know if I'm misreading it, or perhaps if a word is missing, it reads, so far as I know, our stock level is low, and indeed the total stock situation within the SNBTS is at present very healthy. And I wonder if there's some specific reason why the exchange is still necessary. I don't know if that should read, as far as I know, our stock level is not low, and indeed the stock level within the SNBTS is very healthy. In other words, we've got lots of stock. Why do you need to keep receiving it from Belfast? And I'll take you very briefly to the response from Dr Ludlum. That's LOTH 605_085. Have I taken you to the wrong? No. There you are. Thank you. So this is January 1984, Dr Ludlum responding to Dr McLellan. Thank you for your letter about exchanges of commercial Factor 8 with Belfast. The exchange was agreed early in 1983 because at that time SNBTS Factor 8 was in very short supply. The first part of the exchange arrived shortly after the negotiations, and at the time SNBTS material markedly improved. The material that has arrived recently just completes the exchange. As I understand it, we're now quits with Belfast. So it seems to be an exchange that lasts effectively for a year, early 1983 to the start of 1984. I won't take you to it, sir, but in the written notes, it's worth being aware that Professor Cash doesn't seem to have been aware of this arrangement. He writes a letter in January 1984 to Dr Mayne saying that he's just been made aware that there was this arrangement for this exchange, asking to be filled in effectively with the details, highlights some concerns. I'll just read out what he says in this final paragraph. He says, am I right that this arrangement exists? If so, could you illuminate? On the face of it, this development looks a little worrying, AIDS, etc., and I'm anxious to help as much as possible. Now that gets us to later 1983 and into 1984. And it appears when we get to this period that Scotland is, at least on one measure, depending on how you define it, getting close to self-sufficiency in Factor 8. A number of claims begin to be made that Scotland is now self-sufficient in Factor 8. I won't take you to it, but there's a letter from July 1983 from Mr. Watt in which he is informing Professor Cash of his resignation from the PFC. So he announces the resignation in July 1983. He stays on for a few more months before Dr. Perry takes over. In that letter, Mr. Watt says that Scotland has become the first country in the world to be truly self-sufficient in plasma fractions. Now, I'm not going to comment on any further on that claim. So aside from highlighting 2 points, the first is the suggestion that Scotland itself was self-sufficient at this point, July 1983, will have to be considered in the light of some of the figures that we're about to look at from 1983 and indeed 1984 on product usage in Scotland. They seem to suggest that in both in 1983 and in 1984, commercial products, commercial factor rate were still being used. The second point about the international context, I'm afraid I'm not able to assist the inquiry much further with that at this stage. Suffice to say, it may be that it's necessary to investigate that claim further before accepting that it's accurate. Towards the end of 1983, November 1983, the supply situation at the PFC is getting to a point where there's concern that so much factor rate is being produced and added to the national stockpile that some of it is in danger of becoming out of date. Factor rate obviously has a limited shelf life. You can see that in a November 1983 memo from Dr. Perry, an internal PFC memo. He notes that the previous year, the stockpile was 5 million units. It's grown to 7 million units. It starts to question whether some steps should be taken to reduce that stockpile. There's a series of statements and claims that are made from September 1983 to quite a bit later, for example, from the DHSS, the Scottish office, suggesting that by this point Scotland had become either self-sufficient or virtually self-sufficient in blood products as set out in the notes, but worth picking up from a chronological perspective. The next document I'm going to turn to, which examines this issue of self-sufficiency, is a paper prepared by Professor Cash. It's a PRSE 301556. Sorry, I think this is actually the minutes of the meeting rather than Professor Cash's paper. So Professor Cash prepared a paper in advance of this meeting. It's another meeting of haemophilia directors and SNBTS directors, February 1984. If we turn over the page, and we focus on the section 5 review paper from SNBTS, this section of the minutes reflects a discussion of a paper produced by Professor Cash. The first point, so it's worth noting, details of the amount of fresh plasma produced for factor rate concentrates and the issue of concentrates indicated that the production level was about right. However, trends over the last 5 years indicated that the SNBTS production of factor rate concentrates may be exceeding clinical demand, and that current stocks at RTCs appear to be increasing. I'll pick up point 2, subparagraph 2. There's a discussion about the continuing use of cryoprecipitate at this time, February 1984. Members discussed the suggestion that the production of cryoprecipitate could now be reduced. Dr. Ludlum said that cryoprecipitate was preferred in the treatment of children at present because of the new danger of AIDS. Dr. Han concurred. A policy seemed to be emerging, however, to use less cryo for haemophilia A patients. It was agreed that a certain minimal amount of cryo was required, and Dr. Cash pointed out that transfusion directors could produce it in emergencies. If we go down the page, at point 4, I won't go into the detail of this now, but it's just worth noting that Dr. Cash, during the course of this meeting, suggests that the time might be right to introduce a batch dedication system. The reason for that is to reduce the number of batch exposures per patient per year. So this is early 1984. I'll come on a bit later to when batch dedication was introduced by the PFC, but it appears to be the case that it wasn't introduced until sometime later, end of 1984, early 1985. I'll then pick up point 5. Dr. Cash asked members to consider whether, given the present SNBTS production level of factor rate concentrates, it was necessary to purchase commercially unless exceptionally a superior product was available. I take the reference to a superior product been available to mean, as an example, a higher purity product for certain kinds of patients. And if we go over the page, we can see recorded a discussion involving the haemophilia directors about their preferences and approach to commercial versus PFC concentrate. So it's at the top of the page. Dr McDonald said that the adult centre in the West was totally satisfied with the NHS product and that it was no longer necessary to purchase commercially. Dr Han, however, found himself in a position of having inherited 30,000 units of commercial factor VIII, which was rapidly going out of date, and which he was prepared to dispose of. Dr Ludlum said that he required to have a small stock of high purity commercial material. Dr Bell, who's there on behalf of the Scottish Home and Health Department, emphasised that the aim of the SNBTS and of national policy was for Scotland to be self-sufficient, and although the department would not wish to intervene in what clinicians prescribed, it was not sensible to purchase imported material when suitable NHS product was available. In May 1984, so a document was prepared by Professor Cash and a blood transfusion subcommittee meeting took place. I won't take you to those documents. What they concerned was a proposal for Scotland in view of its supply position to send more of its factor VIII products to Northern Ireland and to England and Wales. There's a paper by Professor Cash from May 1984. The title of it is Proposal for the Decanting of Excess Factor VIII Concentrate to Northern Ireland and England and Wales. He sets out in some detail the background to that proposal in the paper. He makes a number of proposals at the end of it. He suggests that the first priority in the disposal exercise should be Northern Ireland, and that's disposal of factor VIII concentrates which are surplus to Scottish needs, and suggests that the residual surplus be offered to the CBLA, i.e. England and Wales. He also suggests that some consideration should be given to charging for the arrangement. There's a meeting in which Professor Cash's proposals are accepted. That takes place on the 23rd of May 1984. We can then see what I believe is that proposal and agreement reflected in a letter between Dr Maurice McLellan in Northern Ireland and Dr Main, and we'll just go to that document. It's NIBS 301718. It's not very easy to read because of the quality of the copy. You can see the date at the top, 21st of May 1984. And if we go down, please. Thank you. I'll pick up the first paragraph where the issue is introduced. Some changes have recently taken place in the arrangements for the supply of blood products from Scotland, and I thought it would be appropriate to update you. Thank you. Factor VIII concentrate. Dr Maurice McLellan says, this has been produced in considerable excess of demand in Scotland during the past year or two, with the result that the present pro-rata arrangement for supplies, in proportion to input of fresh frozen plasma from transfusion centres, is to be abandoned, at least for the present. On a pro-rata basis, we would now be entitled to receive factor VIII at the rate of about 1.8 million units per year. The increase has resulted partly from increased plasma supply and partly from increased yields during fractionation. With this new, more flexible arrangement, we could certainly obtain more than this, at least 2.5 million units per year. And then the next paragraph, I'm aware from conversations with you that you are not at present planning to use this amount, but you may find this information useful for future planning. Now, it's not clear from documents we've looked at in the context, at least of this presentation, why Dr. Main might not have been proposing to use that amount of NHS product. We'll go on to look in a moment at some tables showing consumption figures in Northern Ireland as well as Scotland, which show that a significant amount of commercial product was still in use that time. But this is a reflection, at least, I believe, of Professor Cash's proposals to change those arrangements with Northern Ireland. As for England and Wales, in October 1984, Dr. Perry, who by this point had become acting director of PFC, wrote to Dr. Lane at BPL to offer around 2,000 vials of Factor VIII, equating to about 460,000 units. In the letter, Dr. Perry said that these vials of Factor VIII had failed to meet certain product specifications, things like solubility time. In other words, these products were taking longer to dissolve, certain other technical specifications. Dr. Perry said in the letter that if there was any shortfall in Scotland of PFC product, then they would be sending this product to RTCs. Because their supply position is strong, they don't need it. They're therefore offering it to England and Wales. We can go to Dr. Lane's response to that proposal just very quickly. CBLA 301912. And I should say that in Dr. Perry's letter making the offer, he made reference to tentative evidence in relation to the AIDS infectivity of commercial products. In other words, question marks around AIDS infectivity of commercial products. So would you therefore like to have this Scottish product? Dr. Lane's response that we have here, November 1984, he says, "Thank you for your letter about those batches of Factor VIII which are outside your defined finished product specifications. While I entirely take the point you are making, I do not feel that it's in order to step outside normal regulatory practices, even in our current complicated situation with AIDS. In the same way that we would not release material which failed our quality control. Regardless, I do not think that we would wish to circulate material in a similar category." So Dr. Lane there refusing that offer to take product from Scotland. Now that addresses Factor VIII during this period. I've made some references already to Factor IX. For completeness, I'm going to pick up just a few other pieces, parts of the chronology briefly. The written note during this section separates out Factor VIII and Factor IX. That is because the stories become different in important respects. The chronology of products that are introduced at different times become different, and that's the reason why we've separated them out. I'll highlight just a few points. On the early history of products used to treat haemophilia B patients in Scotland, we've referred in the notes to a 1973 article, a journal article which sets out some of that history. It suggests that until 1967, fresh frozen plasma was the only product available to treat haemophilia B patients. In 1967, the PFC, which was then known as the BPU, began producing a concentrate which contained Factor IX, known as PPSB. But then in 1971, and the article is concerned with the development of this product, a new concentrate is developed, which also contains Factor IX. And this is the product which becomes known as Defix, and it seems to be introduced routinely from around 1971. Now, most of the documents that I've covered in relation to Factor VIII for the 1970s and 1980s suggest that the supply position in relation to a Factor IX concentrate, Defix, was strong. There generally weren't issues with producing enough of it. I've already picked up in a Professor Cash's January 1981 paper, the comment where he says, because of the much smaller number of haemophilia B patients than A, the supply of these products, i.e. factor IX concentrates, is always more than adequate. He makes reference to an exception, I believe that's 1 year in 1979, where the supply dropped. In January 1983, Professor Cash suggested that the supply position with regards to defects remained strong, the issues from PFC to RTCs reasonably stable. At a January 1983 meeting of SNBTS and haemophilia directors, it was noted that the supply position of defects over the last 5 years, so 5 years to 1983, had remained strong and the demand reasonably stable. There's a reference in the documents to a supply difficulty that seems to arise around the middle of 1983. It appears to be related to the use of defects for haemophilia A patients with inhibitors. So around this time, clinicians start to try to treat haemophilia A patients with inhibitors with defects. That has a knock-on effect on the supply of defects, and there are difficulties with keeping up with demand. We set out in the notes how that issue plays out. It continues into February 1985. Now, so that completes the chronological part of this section of the presentation. At this point, I was intending to turn to some of the annexes and figures that the inquiry has produced. We've got a bit of time still, I believe, before the lunch break, so I don't know if you want to break now or if I can continue on. Got some time left.
Well, let's use the time.
Thank you. So if we can get the annexes up, so you should have them at INQY 40344. Thank you. Now, before we go into the detail of the figures and the tables, there are a few points I should explain. This is a document which contains all the annexes accompanying the presentation. Annex A, which we have the first page of here, sets out consumption of factor VIII and then factor IX concentrates in Scotland. Annex B does the same for Northern Ireland. Both Annex A and Annex B, and both the factor VIII and factor IX figures, are based on annual returns from haemophilia centres. You can see at this page we have set out the annual returns that apply to Scotland with the URNs in footnotes at the bottom. So as we go through the figures and the tables, if any call participants, legal representatives at any point want to interrogate any of the figures, check whether we've got them right, if they want to look into particular issues, all of the sources for the data should be set out in those footnotes. One effect of using the returns as the source of data means that the narrative, when the figures only start in 1976, that's when the earliest date for which we have returns. Those returns are probably the most accurate guide to consumption of these different factor concentrates during this time period that we have. But there are also, in some of them, gaps, issues with how the data is recorded, and it's important to be aware of them. What we've done in the tables is try to flag any of those issues so that readers can be aware of them as they're looking at the tables and at the figures. And lastly, so I've already said that we've used the word consumption here rather than demand to this table. In fact, that wasn't quite lastly. One more point, introductory point to note. These are consumption figures rather than production figures. That may be an obvious distinction, but it's an important one to bear in mind, because in some of the documents there are references to production, i.e. how much the PFC was producing each year. Figures for consumption are, of course, different. So we could turn, please, to page 2. So this is the table setting out, actually, could we have, yeah, that's fine, actually, that's fine, that'll do for now, thank you. These are the figures recording in Scotland consumption of factor VIII products, going from 1976 to 1990, you'll be able to see that there are footnotes which appear next to some of the entries, for example, 1981, 1982. In fact, also at the heading at the top, next to cryoprecipitate, there are footnotes. And if we pan back out, please, Sully, and go into the footnotes. I wouldn't ordinarily go to footnotes, so but we've highlighted them here, and I think they're important to bear in mind. They suggest some caveats. One of the caveats relates to figures for cryoprecipitate. In some of the annual returns, as we've seen during the Haemophilia Centre presentations and hearings, cryoprecipitate was sometimes recorded in number of bags or packs. Generally speaking, we've translated that into 70 units per pack, which correlates with some explanations which are sometimes given in the returns. Obviously, all cryoprecipitate figures are estimates, even when there's a number recorded in return. That's based on an estimate of units per pack, an important point to bear in mind. When we've set out the figures for cryoprecipitate consumption, that also they include the figures for patients with von Willebrands. For much of this period, patients with von Willebrands were treated with cryoprecipitate. Now, what that means is that the comparison, at least for some of the period, between cryoprecipitate and factor concentrates becomes less direct because von Willebrands patients generally weren't treated with factor concentrates, so far as I understand it. But we thought that these were an important part of the overall picture in terms of cryoprecipitate consumption at the time, so we've included that. In terms of data for individual returns, gaps in the data, some of them make more difference than others. There's one I want to pick up here because it does make a material difference to the tables we're going to go on to look at, or the figures, the charts we're going to look at. It's the Edinburgh data for 1981. Now, the annual return for Edinburgh in 1981, it's only very faintly legible. We can just about make out the figures for cryoprecipitate. Unfortunately, it's not possible to make out what the figures were for NHS or commercial concentrate. That's an important caveat to bear in mind when we go on to look at the tables. Now, the data here has been used to create, first of all, a graph and then a set of bar charts. So if we can go on to the next page, I'm going to spend less time on this one. We can see how the figures have translated. Now, the blue line is NHS, PFC, factor VIII concentrate. The orange line is cryoprecipitate. The red line is commercial concentrate. We can see that commercial concentrate is at a low level in the early period, increases a little up to about 1980, it starts to decrease again to reach very low periods in 1984, on low figures in 1984, and in fact, when we get to 1984 onwards, we'll see just how far the figures drop. Cryoprecipitate, relatively steady until 1980, and then starts to decrease. The use of PFC concentrate increases slowly in the 1976 to 1979 period. There's a significant jump in 1980. I haven't interrogated the exact reasons for that jump. It may be related to Professor Ludlum's arrival in Edinburgh. As I understand it, he changed the treatment policies in Edinburgh to have more of a focus on the use of concentrate rather than cryo. I should say the dots represent years. On the blue line, after 1980, here there's a suggestion of a drop in 1981. That is likely to be a somewhat artificial figure because in 1981, we don't have the return data for Edinburgh for its use of concentrate. And then we can see the figures increasing from 82 up to 84, dropping down and then increasing again as we move through the second half of the 1980s. And if we go on to the next page, please, Sully. Now, again, this is the same data that's recorded in the tables, this time translated into a bar chart. This might be a helpful charts for trying to assess whether or not self-sufficiency was achieved when it was achieved. Now, I'm not going to go into all the different definitions of that term, sir, but one way of defining the term might be, were patients treated with domestic product only, or were they also treated with imported product? And we can see that Scottish patients are treated with some commercial concentrate, which is the red block, relatively small amounts at the end of the 1970s, a larger amount in 1980. There's the figures for 1981, although they come with that same health warning because of the Edinburgh gap. Relatively small amounts of commercial concentrate. There's still some being used in 82, 83, a very small amount in 84, and then no commercial concentrate recorded used in 85, 86, 87, which coincides with the introduction of heat-treated factor 8 in Scotland. If we look at the figures for cryo, we can see, starting in the 1976, relatively steady levels, small increase in 1981, then the figures start to drop off, and then PFC factor 8, reasonably steady levels in the second half of the 1970s, a significant increase in use in 1980. I'll ignore 1981 for the reason I've given before. And then from 82 onwards, we can see that PFC factor 8 becomes, by some distance, represents the greatest proportion in use of these products from 82, 83, 84 onwards. I haven't yet covered heat treatment. I'll do that very briefly. But we can see that when we get to 88, by which time all factor concentrates at least are heat treated, commercial products make a reappearance, 88, 89, 90. So that's the picture for factor 8 in Scotland that we've been able to establish from the data. I'll look more briefly at factor 9. We could go over the page, please, Sally. So we started again with a table of figures. I won't go through it in as much detail. A few caveats to note in footnotes that people can come back to. It's a bit easier to see from this table what the position is, because we can see in the right-hand column commercial factor 9. Most years, no use of commercial factor 9 recorded, other than 1980, 1981. If we go on to, in fact, can we go straight to the chart? So I think it'll be the bar chart 2 pages on. You can see these figures translated into this bar chart. They are mostly blue, so it's mostly NHS factor 9 concentrate that's been used. Small amounts of commercial factor 9 in 1980 and 1981. In contrast to factor 8, commercial factor 9 makes a reappearance in 1985. I'll come on to explain very briefly the reasons why that happened. In short, it's related to the introduction of a PFC heat-treated factor 9 during the course of 1985, being later than the commercial heat-treated factor 9 products were then available. In other words, clinicians got to 1985, PFC wasn't yet able to provide a heat-treated factor 9, so they started buying some commercial heat-treated factor 9. We'll turn briefly to Northern Ireland. Can we go to the next page, please? So this is the introduction to Annex B, which covers Northern Ireland. Again, similar points and caveats as summarised at the top. We'll start with factor 8 on the next page, please. A similar table is set out. We'll see this when we go on to the graphs and the charts. But as we've covered during the course of this presentation, it's important to be aware that there was a change in the arrangements for Northern Ireland. BPL or BPL/PFL generally providing factor 8 concentrate up to 1982 PFC taking over in 1982. And in fact, if we just look at this table for a moment, and if you see the column for NHS factor rate, and we move down the figures from the late 1970s to the early 1980s, we get to 1981, 122,000 units, then we see a very significant drop to 12,000 units in 1982. That's the changeover year. And I took you, sir, yesterday afternoon to the Northern Ireland return for 1982, which records that NHS factor rate was only available in November and December of that year. If we can go over the page, please, Sully. We can see here a different picture in Northern Ireland than in Scotland. So again, the red line is commercial concentrate, the blue line is NHS factor rate. Up to 1982, that comes from BPL, and then it comes from PFC. The orange line is cryoprecipitate. If we go onto the bar chart, please. On the next page, thank you. We can again see a different picture emerging from the one we just looked at in Scotland. In short, much more red, which means much more in the way of commercial concentrates, particularly in the period up to 1982. Still significant amounts of commercial concentrate being used in 83 and 84. Still commercial concentrate being used in 1985, though by that stage it may have been heat treated. One of the reasons for explaining why the figures for NHS PFC concentrate don't increase immediately, my understanding is that because the Northern Ireland arrangement was a pro-rata one with PFC, it took some time for Northern Ireland to increase the amount of fresh frozen plasma that it was collecting and was able to supply to PFC, so it took some time to increase the amount of PFC factor rate that it was receiving in return. And the next page, please, Sully. Factor 9, I'm not going to go through the figures in this table. If we could go through 2 pages onto the bar chart for Northern Ireland. So this is the position for factor 9 in Northern Ireland. As we can see, some commercial factor 9 being used in 1976-77, almost as much commercial factor 9 used as NHS factor 9 in 1978, and then no commercial factor 9 used again before 1990, by which time it will have been heat treated. So that takes me to the end of this section of the presentation. I was intending next to turn much more briefly to the arrival of heat treatment in Scotland and in Northern Ireland. I will finish that portion of the presentation and the presentation overall in time for Mr. Hill to take over to cover pool sizes. I wonder if it might be a convenient moment to break for lunch now. I then anticipate that I'll be able to try and finish things in the early part of the afternoon.
Yes, well, shall we break then now until 10 to 2? 10 to 2.